November 14th, 1978, 9:23 a.m. Apartment 47, Leninsky Prospect, Moscow. The cream-colored envelope arrives with the morning mail, slipped between a utility bill and a party newsletter. Valentina Mikhailovna Sokolov turns it over in her hands at the kitchen table, noting the expensive paper stock, the careful calligraphy. Her husband Dmitri hasn't yet left for his position at the Institute of Theoretical Physics. Their daughter Katya, 16, practices piano in the next room. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the notes floating through the apartment like cigarette smoke. Outside, November sleet taps against the windows. The radiator hisses its metallic song. Valentina slices the envelope open with her grandmother's silver letter opener, a family heirloom that survived the siege of Leningrad. The invitation inside announces the wedding of Nikolai Pavlovich Kostin to Elena Andreevna Marchenko. Saturday, December 16th, 1978. Church of the Resurrection, Leningrad. Reception to follow at the Hotel Astoria. Dmitri glances over her shoulder, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He freezes. The cup trembles slightly, dark liquid rippling. Where did you get this? The mail. It just came. Kolya is getting married? He sets the cup down carefully, too carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter something invisible. I haven't spoken to Kolya in 3 years. The invitation has both our names. Valentina traces the calligraphy with her fingertip. See? Dmitri Ivanovich and Valentina Mikhailovna Sokolov. It's addressed specifically to us. In the next room, Katya's piano playing stops mid-phrase. The silence feels wrong, pregnant with something Valentina cannot name. Through the thin walls, she hears their neighbor's television, the morning news describing grain harvests in Kazakhstan. Ordinary sounds. Everything is ordinary. Dmitri has gone pale, though, his fingers drumming against the table in a nervous pattern Valentina hasn't seen since his mandatory military service ended, back when night terrors woke him gasping about things he would never discuss. We're not going, he says. But Kolya was your closest friend at university. You were in his wedding party when he married. That was different. That was before. He stands abruptly, knocking his coffee cup. Brown liquid spreads across the formica, reaching toward the invitation like an accusation. We're not going, Valya. I need to make a phone call. He leaves the kitchen. Valentina hears him in the hallway, dialing the shared telephone, speaking in low, urgent tones she cannot decipher. She stares at the invitation, at the elegant script promising celebration and joy. Outside, a black Volga sedan pulls up to the curb. 2 men in dark overcoats emerge, their breath visible in the cold air. They look up at the building, consulting something, a paper, an address. One of them points. The radiator hisses again. Valentina realizes her hands are shaking. To understand how a simple wedding invitation triggered the machinery of state murder, one must first understand the peculiar ecosystem of Soviet scientific intelligentsia in the late 1970s, and the invisible lines that separated privilege from peril. Dmitri Ivanovich Sokolov belonged to a specific caste, theoretical physicists working on projects classified at Level 1, the highest security designation in the Soviet system. His official title at the Institute of Theoretical Physics was Senior Research Fellow, Department of Applied Mathematics. His actual work involved calculating blast radiuses and fallout patterns for third-generation tactical nuclear weapons. Level 1 scientists occupied a strange position in Soviet society. They lived better than ordinary citizens, larger apartments, access to special stores, permission to own private automobiles. They attended conferences in East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Their children attended the best schools. But they also existed under constant surveillance, their movements tracked, their friendships monitored, their correspondence read by specialists in Department K of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate. They signed documents acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure of state secrets carried penalties ranging from 15 years in the Gulag to execution. They understood that their families served as collateral for their silence. The system worked through a principle KGB theorists called stable equilibrium. Scientists had too much to lose to defect, too little freedom to betray. For 15 years, Dmitry Sokolov maintained perfect balance within the system. He published unclassified papers on mathematical physics. He attended party meetings. He never traveled beyond the socialist bloc. He raised his daughter to be a model Soviet citizen. His wife taught French literature at Moscow State University, carefully avoiding authors whose politics might raise questions. The Sokolovs were, by all observable metrics, entirely loyal. But loyalty in the Soviet system was not a binary state. It existed on a spectrum, constantly measured, perpetually evaluated. And the wedding invitation that arrived on November 14, 1978, triggered a cascade of reevaluation that exposed fractures in the Sokolov family's carefully constructed facade. Nikolai Pavlovich Kostin, the groom, had been Dmitry's roommate at Moscow State University from 1958 to 1963. They studied physics together, argued about Heisenberg and Bohr in their shared dormitory room, spent summers at the same research camp near Lake Baikal. After graduation, their paths diverged. Dmitry entered weapons research. Kostin went into experimental plasma physics, theoretically benign work on fusion reactor design. They maintained their friendship through the 1960s, attending each other's weddings, celebrating New Year's together, their families intertwined by affection and shared memories. Then in December 1975, Kostin attended an international physics conference in Vienna. This was not unusual. Fusion research was considered safe for international collaboration, unlike weapons work. Soviet scientists regularly attended such conferences under careful KGB supervision. Kostin returned on schedule, filed the required reports, resumed his work. Nothing appeared amiss. But 6 months later, in June 1976, Kostin's first wife, Irina Sergeyevna, a microbiologist, died in what official records described as a laboratory accident, exposure to contaminated samples, a closed casket funeral. Kostin took bereavement leave, returning to work 3 months later visibly changed, thinner, quieter, drinking more heavily at institute functions. His colleagues attributed this to grief. Department K attributed it to something else. Because between his wife's death and his return to work, Kostin had done something that triggered alerts in KGB surveillance protocols. He had established contact with a foreigner, specifically with Dr. Helena Marchenko, a Ukrainian-Canadian physicist working on fusion research at the University of Toronto. Their correspondence began with a condolence letter she sent after reading of Irina's death in an international physics journal. It continued with discussions of plasma containment techniques. It evolved into something that surveillance analysts classified as inappropriate emotional attachment. By Soviet law, correspondence with foreigners required official approval. Kostin had not sought approval. When investigators confronted him, he claimed ignorance of the regulation, a plausible defense, since the rules governing scientific correspondence changed frequently and often contradicted each other. He received a formal reprimand. The correspondence ceased. The matter appeared closed. Except Helena Marchenko was not simply a Canadian physicist. She was, according to files that would not be declassified until 2003, a second-generation refugee whose parents had fled Ukraine during the chaos of 1943. Her father had served briefly in the short-lived Ukrainian insurgent army before escaping westward ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. In KGB classification, this made Helena Marchenko a person with hostile bloodline, someone whose family history created presumptive security concerns regardless of her own actions or beliefs. The fact that Kostin had fallen in love with her, and that she had somehow obtained permission to enter the Soviet Union in November 1978 to marry him, represented an intelligence puzzle that demanded explanation. How had a woman with Ukrainian nationalist family connections received a Soviet visa? What assessment had determined she posed no security risk? Who had approved this exception? The answers resided in classified personnel files that revealed a bureaucratic accident of remarkable consequence. Helena Marchenko's visa application had been processed through the Ministry of Culture rather than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a routing error that meant her family history received only cursory review. Civil servant who approved her visa had no access to KGB databases flagging her father's wartime activities. She appeared in official documents as simply Canadian physicist, age 34, unmarried, seeking entry for marriage to Soviet citizen. When Department K discovered this error in early November 1978, triggered by routine review of approved visas, multiple officials faced career-ending consequences. But more immediately, it created an operational problem. Helena Marchenko would arrive in the Soviet Union in less than 6 weeks, marry a Level 1 security clearance holder with access to sensitive fusion research, and potentially establish a permanent presence in Soviet territory. The marriage had already been announced. Invitations had been sent. Canceling now would require public explanation. The KGB faced a choice. They could allow the marriage, placing Kostin under enhanced surveillance and accepting the security risk. They could arrest Kostin on manufactured charges, but this would draw attention and create diplomatic complications. Or they could employ what internal documents called prophylactic measures, steps taken to eliminate security risks before they fully materialized. On November 10, 1978, a classified memorandum from Colonel Viktor Maximovich Chebrikov, future chairman of the KGB, landed on desks throughout the Second Chief Directorate. Subject: persons with close association to subject Kostin, NP. The memorandum listed 17 names. Individuals whose relationships with Kostin created potential security vulnerabilities. Dmitry Sokolov's name appeared third on the list, accompanied by the notation, Level 1 clearance, tactical weapons research. Contact with subject ceased, 1976, following Kostin's security incident. Re-establish surveillance. Assess continued reliability. The wedding invitation was not simply an invitation. It was a test. The surveillance file on Dmitry Sokolov, declassified in fragmentary form in 2007 and more completely in 2015, reveals that KGB interest in him predated the Kostin affair by more than a decade. It began in 1967 when Sokolov, then a junior researcher, submitted a paper to an international journal proposing novel mathematical approaches to multi-body problems. The paper contained no classified information, but its methodology, elegant recursive algorithms that could theoretically model complex systems, caught the attention of intelligence analysts who recognized potential weapons applications. Sokolov was quietly transferred to the Institute of Theoretical Physics' classified division. He was 26 years old, newly married, unaware that his mathematical genius had sealed him inside the Soviet security apparatus for life. He adapted to his new role with apparent ease, producing calculations that improved targeting accuracy for medium-range ballistic missiles. His work earned him commendations, a larger apartment, permission to purchase a Zhiguli automobile. He never expressed doubt about his contributions to Soviet military capability. But surveillance transcripts from November 1978 reveal something observers had missed for 11 years. Dmitry Sokolov maintained a private journal, written in a mathematical notation he had invented, unreadable to anyone unfamiliar with his idiosyncratic symbolic system. After his arrest, cryptographers spent 3 months breaking his code. What they found was not espionage, not weapons data, not evidence of betrayal. They found moral anguish. February 3, 1974, one translated entry read, completed calculations for dispersal pattern of enhanced radiation weapon over urban environment. Population density, 5,000 per square kilometer. Casualty projections, 87% mortality within 72 hours in primary zone. I am calculating how to kill children more efficiently. I attend Katya's school concert tomorrow. She will play Rachmaninoff. How do I reconcile these things? Another entry from September 1976. Kolya stopped calling. Valya says it's natural that friendships fade. But I know why he doesn't call. He saw something when he was in Vienna. He came back changed. He looks at me differently now, as if he knows what I really do, what my calculations mean. I cannot blame him for keeping distance. The KGB had missed these entries during routine searches because they appeared as mathematical notation, innocent strings of symbols and equations. But Sokolov's private torment rendered him, in KGB assessment, ideologically unstable, a category that described individuals whose commitment to Soviet goals wavered due to personal ethical considerations. Such individuals were not immediately dangerous, but they were vulnerable to recruitment by hostile intelligence services. They were fault lines waiting for pressure. When Kostin's wedding invitation arrived, that pressure arrived with it. The surveillance team watching the Sokolov apartment on November 14th observed Dmitri's reaction. The sudden pallor, the spilled coffee, the urgent phone call. The phone call went to a number registered to the Institute of Theoretical Physics, specifically to the office of Dmitri's direct supervisor, Professor Yevgeny Borisovich Malenkov. Surveillance transcripts record the conversation. Sokolov: Yevgeny Borisovich, I need to speak with you. It's urgent. Malenkov: I'm preparing for a meeting. Can this wait? Sokolov: No, it cannot. I need advice on a personal matter with security implications. Pause. 4 seconds. Malenkov: Come to my office. Now. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. No recording exists. Malenkov's office was not wired for sound, a deliberate oversight that allowed supervisors to hold unofficial conversations with subordinates. But Dmitri's behavior after leaving the meeting told surveillance observers everything they needed to know. He went directly to the Institute's security office and filed a voluntary report, document 47K, describing receipt of the wedding invitation and his intention not to attend due to concerns about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries with individuals whose security status has been questioned. This voluntary report was exactly what the KGB had designed the wedding invitation to provoke. It revealed Dmitri's awareness that Kostin had become a security concern. It demonstrated Dmitri's willingness to sacrifice personal friendship for security compliance. It should have marked him as reliably loyal. Instead, it marked him for elimination. The problem was timing. Dmitri filed his report on November 14th at 11:47 a.m., approximately 2 hours after receiving the invitation. This meant he had spent 2 hours in his apartment with the invitation before taking action. Surveillance photographs from that morning showed Dmitri at his kitchen table, the invitation before him, his head in his hands. What had he been thinking during those 2 hours? What internal debate had occurred? What decision had he almost made differently? According to protocols outlined in KGB Internal Directive 47 PR 1975, delay in reporting security concerns indicated psychological resistance to compliance obligations. 2 hours was classified as significant delay. Combined with Dmitri's Level 1 clearance and access to tactical nuclear weapons data, this delay transformed him from ideologically unstable to operationally dangerous. The assessment noted, subject demonstrated hesitation before fulfilling security obligations. Hesitation indicates divided loyalty. Subject poses unacceptable risk of ideological compromise if subjected to sustained recruitment pressure from hostile intelligence services. The wedding invitation had served its purpose perfectly. It had revealed the crack in Dmitri Sokolov's loyalty. Not treachery, not betrayal, but something perhaps more dangerous: human doubt. On November 15th, Colonel Mikhail Andreevich Suslov, head of Department K operations in Moscow, convened a classified meeting with 3 subordinates in a secure conference room beneath Lubyanka headquarters. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. No minutes were recorded, but subsequent actions make clear what was decided. Dmitri Sokolov would be neutralized, and the neutralization would extend to his family. KGB doctrine held that partial measures created complications. Arrested scientists might attract Western attention. Disappeared scientists left families who could agitate for investigation. Complete elimination, arranged to appear accidental, solved multiple problems simultaneously. The decision required approval from the KGB chairman, but this was considered formality. Requests for prophylactic measures against security risks were rarely denied, particularly when the target held Level 1 clearance and had demonstrated ideological instability. The paperwork was prepared, routed upward, approved within 72 hours. But the Sokolov operation required careful orchestration. 3 people needed to die in ways that appeared unrelated to state action. The method chosen was elegant in its brutality. A staged automobile accident during a family trip to Leningrad. The Sokolovs would receive an unexpected invitation, not to a wedding, but to a special performance at the Mariinsky Theater. Premium seats, all expenses covered, a reward for Dmitri's years of service. They would depart Moscow by car on Saturday, December 9th. On the highway between Novgorod and Leningrad, their vehicle would suffer catastrophic brake failure on an icy curve. The car would leave the road, strike trees, catch fire. A tragic accident. 3 victims. Closed caskets. State funeral with full honors. The brake mechanism that would cause the accident was already being prepared in a KGB technical laboratory. The invitation to the theater performance was being printed on authentic Mariinsky letterhead. The highway patrol officers, who would be first to arrive at the accident scene, were being briefed on their roles. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then, Valentina Mikhailovna made a telephone call that no one had anticipated. Valentina Sokolov taught French literature at Moscow State University's Department of Romance Languages, a position she had held since 1968. Her specialty was 19th century French realist fiction, Balzac, Flaubert, Zola, authors whose unflinching examination of social corruption made them ideologically acceptable for Soviet study while remaining artistically significant. She was considered an excellent teacher, demanding but fair, capable of making Madame Bovary's provincial despair relevant to students who had never left the Soviet Union. But Valentina had a secret that her personnel file did not record. She read samizdat, not political manifestos or dissident polemics, but literature that could not be officially published. Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle, Grossman's Life and Fate. She obtained these typewritten manuscripts through an underground network of academics who passed them hand to hand, reading quickly before passing them onward, maintaining plausible deniability about their content. She was not a dissident. She attended party meetings, signed loyalty oaths, taught approved curriculum. But she read forbidden books because she believed great literature illuminated truth that ideology obscured. She believed that understanding how power corrupted required reading. Accounts of corruption, written by those who had witnessed it directly. She believed, though she would never have articulated this even to herself, that the Soviet system rested on organized mendacity, and that maintaining her humanity required acknowledging realities the system denied. On November 16th, 2 days after the wedding invitation arrived, Valentina made a decision that would doom her family. She did not understand the significance of this decision at the time. She thought she was simply reaching out to an old friend. The friend was Nadezhda Yakovlevna Mandelstam, widow of the poet Osip Mandelstam, who had died in a transit camp in 1938. Nadezhda had survived Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev through a combination of obscurity and stubborn vitality. She lived in a small apartment in Moscow's Arbat district, surviving on minimal pension, receiving visitors who sought connection to Russia's pre-Soviet intellectual tradition. Valentina had met her in 1974 at a clandestine reading of Akhmatova's Requiem. They had maintained occasional contact since then, exchanging books, discussing literature. carefully avoiding direct political statements that might endanger either of them. Valentina called Nadezhda on November 16th at 3:30 p.m. from a public telephone booth on Gorky Street. The call lasted 7 minutes. KGB surveillance of Mandelstam's telephone recorded the entire conversation. Valentina: Nadezhda Yakovlevna, it's Valentina Sokolov. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Mandelstam: Not at all, dear. How are you? Valentina: I need to ask you something. I don't know who else to ask. Pause. 3 seconds. Mandelstam: What troubles you? Valentina: My husband received an invitation from an old friend, a wedding, but he says we cannot go. He was frightened by the invitation. I've never seen him frightened like this, and now things feel wrong. Men are watching our building. The same car has been parked outside for 3 days. I'm probably being paranoid, but... Pause. 5 seconds. Mandelstam: You're not being paranoid. Listen to me carefully. If your husband is frightened, there is reason. If men are watching, there is reason. You must trust your instincts. The invitation means something you don't understand. Your husband understands. Trust his fear. Valentina: But what should I do? Mandelstam: Nothing. Do nothing unusual. Maintain routine. Don't make telephone calls from home. If you need to reach me again, come in person. Valentina: You're scaring me. Mandelstam: Good. Fear is appropriate. Fear keeps you alert. Do you remember what I told you about the 1930s? The pattern always begins the same way. First comes the invitation, then comes the watch, then comes the knock at the door. If you see the invitation and the watch, you must act before the knock. The call ended. Valentina returned to her apartment. She said nothing to Dmitri about the conversation. But that night, after Dmitri fell asleep, she did something that surveillance cameras could not observe. She retrieved her grandmother's silver letter opener from its drawer and placed it under her pillow. Not as a weapon. Silver letter openers are useless as weapons. But as a talisman, an object connecting her to ancestors who had survived Stalin's purges through vigilance and luck. The surveillance transcript of Valentina's call to Mandelstam landed on Colonel Suslov's desk on November 17th. His reaction, recorded in marginalia on the transcript's cover page, was succinct. Subject's wife demonstrates elevated awareness. Accelerate timeline. The original plan called for elimination in early December. The accelerated plan called for November 24th, 7 days away. But acceleration required modification to the operational approach. The theater invitation scheme required 2 weeks of preparation, printing authentic documents, coordinating with Mariinsky staff who would unknowingly provide false confirmation of the event, positioning maintenance personnel to sabotage the Sokolov's vehicle undetected. 7 days was insufficient. An alternative method was needed. The alternative chosen was fire. Specifically, an apartment fire caused by electrical malfunction in aging Soviet-era wiring, a common occurrence in Moscow's older buildings. The Sokolovs lived on the 4th floor of a 7-story building constructed in 1957. Its electrical system was original, overloaded by modern appliances, poorly maintained. Fire inspectors had cited the building multiple times. Residents complained regularly about flickering lights, blown fuses, outlets that sparked when appliances were plugged in. A fire in apartment 47 would surprise no one. If the fire occurred at night, when all 3 family members were home, and if the apartment's door had been damaged somehow, perhaps by renovation work, perhaps by a defective lock, preventing escape, and if the building's fire alarm system failed, a chronic problem in Moscow apartment blocks, then 3 deaths would be tragic, but explicable. Investigation would reveal electrical malfunction. Neighbors would describe previous complaints. The building's management office would face sanctions. The Sokolov family would receive a state funeral. The technical division prepared an incendiary device designed to mimic electrical fire. Magnesium ribbon inserted into the apartment's main breaker box. rigged to ignite at 3 a.m. on November 24th when electrical resistance reached a predetermined threshold. The device would be installed by maintenance personnel during routine inspection on November 22nd. The apartment's door lock would be damaged during the same inspection, filed down subtly so it would jam when force was applied from inside. The building's fire alarm would be disabled that evening during system testing. Everything was arranged. The operation had moved from planning to execution phase. Then, on November 20th, Dmitry Sokolov failed to report for work. Absence without notification violated protocols for Level 1 security clearance holders. When Dmitry did not arrive at the Institute of Theoretical Physics by 9:15 a.m. on November 20th, his supervisor, Professor Malenkov, initiated emergency procedures. Security personnel were dispatched to the Sokolov apartment. They arrived at 9:47 a.m. to find the apartment empty. Neighbors reported seeing the family depart in their Zhiguli automobile at approximately 7:30 a.m., suitcases visible in the vehicle. The Sokolovs had run. KGB reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Department K activated Protocol 7 emergency, reserved for defection. Attempts by critical security personnel. Roadblocks were established on major highways leaving Moscow. Railway stations received photographs and descriptions. Border crossings went to maximum alert. Airport security was notified. Within 2 hours of Dmitry's absence being reported, over 500 law enforcement and intelligence personnel were searching for the Sokolov family. But the Sokolovs were not fleeing to a border. They were not attempting defection. Valentina's conversation with Nadezhda Mandelstam had convinced her that danger was imminent, but she had no understanding of its nature or scope. She believed, reasonably but incorrectly, that the danger came from Dmitry's association with Kostin, and that distance from Moscow would provide safety until the wedding had passed and attention had shifted elsewhere. Dmitry had been easier to convince than Valentina expected. When she woke him at 6 a.m. on November 20th and told him they needed to leave immediately, he asked only one question: "Did someone warn you?" She nodded. He rose without further discussion and began packing. Their destination was Dmitry's aunt's dacha near Klin, a small town 85 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The dacha was officially registered to Dmitry's late mother, technically still family property, though rarely used. It had no telephone. It sat isolated on 3 hectares of birch forest. No neighbors lived within a kilometer. Dmitry believed they could shelter there for 2 weeks, long enough for the wedding to pass, long enough for whatever surveillance had triggered his fear to relax. This belief demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of the machinery pursuing them. The KGB was not conducting routine surveillance. They were executing an elimination order. Dmitry's flight had transformed him from a security risk requiring prophylactic neutralization into an active defector requiring immediate capture. The decision to run, intended to ensure safety, had instead guaranteed death. The Sokolovs reached the dacha at 11:20 a.m. They carried sufficient food for 2 weeks: blankets, candles, books. Katya was bewildered, but compliant, trusting her parents' unexplained urgency. Dmitry checked the dacha's wood stove, ensured it functioned properly, barricaded the door with furniture. Valentina unpacked food, rationing carefully. They settled in to wait. KGB search protocols for missing Level 1 personnel followed predictable patterns: known associates, family properties, regular travel routes. Dmitry's aunt's dacha appeared on a registry search by 2:30 p.m. on November 20th. A surveillance team was dispatched at 3:15 p.m. They confirmed the presence of the Sokolov family's vehicle, parked behind the dacha, at 4:47 p.m. Colonel Suslov received confirmation at 5:30 p.m. His decision was recorded in operational log 47K78. Subjects located. Request immediate authorization for field neutralization. The authorization came through at 6:15 p.m. Not from Moscow headquarters, but directly from Yuri Andropov, chairman of the KGB, who had been personally briefed on the Sokolov matter due to its intersection with the Kostin-Marchenko diplomatic complication. Andropov's response, typed on his official letterhead, was preserved in files declassified in 2015. Authorization granted. Operational security takes priority. Eliminate all subjects. Ensure zero witnesses. Destroy all documentation linking subjects to state security apparatus. Official cause of death. Domestic incident. Close file immediately upon completion. 8 men were assigned to the operation. They departed Moscow at 7:30 p.m. in 2 vehicles. They carried no identification, wore civilian clothing, carried weapons registered to no official armory. Their instructions were explicit. Kill all 3 members of the Sokolov family. Stage the scene to indicate murder-suicide precipitated by domestic conflict. Burn the dacha completely to destroy forensic evidence. Return to Moscow before dawn. None of the men had met the Sokolovs. None knew what Dmitri's research involved. None asked why 3 civilians required execution. They were specialists in what KGB parlance called wet work, and they followed orders without question. The team reached the dacha at 9:45 p.m. They parked their vehicles 1 kilometer away and approached on foot through the birch forest. Temperature had dropped to -12 Celsius. Fresh snow muffled their footsteps. Lights were visible in the dacha's windows, candlelight, as the dacha had no electrical service. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the smell of burning birchwood. Inside, the Sokolov family was preparing for sleep, believing themselves safe, believing they had escaped whatever danger Valentina had sensed. The operational plan was simple. Surround the dacha, simultaneously breach front and rear entrances, eliminate all subjects with suppressed firearms, stage murder-suicide scene, Dmitri shoots wife and daughter, then himself, marital conflict as motive, ignite accelerant-soaked materials to destroy forensic evidence, withdraw before fire attracts attention. The team moved into position at 10:15 p.m. 4 men covered exits. 4 men prepared to breach. Colonel Suslov's orders specified no communication with subjects, no warnings, no demands for surrender, no questions. This was not arrest. This was execution. At 10:17 p.m., the team leader gave the signal. Both doors were kicked simultaneously. What happened next is documented only through fragmentary accounts from surviving team members, obtained during post-Soviet investigations in the 1990s. The accounts are inconsistent, shaped by decades of self-serving revision, but certain facts emerged from cross-referencing. The dacha was empty. The fire in the stove had been maintained with a clever timer mechanism, logs arranged to collapse at intervals, creating the illusion of tending. Candles had been positioned near windows to cast shadows suggesting movement. The Sokolov family's winter, coats hung on pegs, their boots sat by the door, their suitcases lay open in the bedroom. But Dmitri, Valentina, and Katya were gone. The team searched the dacha frantically, then expanded to the surrounding forest. Flashlights swept through birch trees, illuminating nothing but snow and shadow. No footprints led away from the building. Fresh snowfall had covered any tracks. No vehicle sounds suggested escape by automobile. The Sokolovs had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. At 11:30 p.m., the team leader radioed Moscow for instructions. Colonel Suslov's response was recorded in communications logs. Impossible. Building has been under observation. No one departed. Search again. They searched until 4 o'clock a.m., when approaching dawn made continued presence dangerous. They found nothing. No bodies. No evidence of where the family had gone. No explanation. The team returned to Moscow and reported failure, an unprecedented outcome for a KGB elimination operation. The official investigation that followed was classified at the highest level. Theories proliferated. The Sokolovs had been warned by an unknown source inside the KGB. They had received assistance from Western intelligence services. Dmitri had prepared an escape plan months in advance. But none of these theories explained how 3 people had exited a dacha under surveillance without detection, or where they had gone in sub-zero temperatures without coats or boots, or how they had survived in the forest without supplies. The truth was simultaneously simpler and stranger than any KGB theory. The Sokolovs had never been in the dacha at all. Dmitry Sokolov had been trained by the Soviet Army in survival techniques during his mandatory military service, 1964 to 1966. Part of this training involved evasion and resistance to interrogation, skills considered essential for officers who might face capture during war. The training included techniques for creating false trails, establishing hide sites, surviving in hostile territory without support. Dmitry had been a mediocre soldier in most respects, but he had excelled at evasion exercises, demonstrating intuitive understanding of how to think like pursuers in order to avoid them. When Valentina convinced him to flee Moscow, Dmitry immediately began thinking like his pursuers. He understood that fleeing would trigger search protocols. He understood that family properties would be checked. He understood that the dacha represented an obvious destination. And he understood that obvious destinations were exactly where surveillance concentrated. So he used the dacha as a decoy. The Sokolovs drove to the dacha on November 20th, arriving at 11:20 a.m. as planned. But they stayed only 90 minutes. During that time, Dmitry arranged the stage. He stocked the stove with logs positioned to burn at intervals, creating the illusion of tending throughout the night. He placed candles near windows, tilted to cast shadows. He unpacked suitcases, hung coats, positioned boots, evidence of habitation. Then at 12:50 p.m., before any surveillance team could arrive, the family departed. They did not take their Jiguli. The car remained parked behind the dacha, visible evidence that the family was sheltering there. Instead, they walked 3 kilometers through forest to a secondary road, where Dmitry flagged down a passing delivery truck. He paid the driver 50 rubles, 2 weeks' salary for a Soviet worker, to transport them to the town of Klin without asking questions. The driver, grateful for unexpected income, agreed. From Klin, they took a commuter train to Kalinin, now Tver, paying cash, avoiding ticket sellers who might remember them. From Kalinin, they took a bus to Rybinsk. They traveled as anonymous citizens, speaking to no one, drawing no attention. They moved deeper into provincial Russia, away from Moscow, away from major cities, into the vast anonymous interior where KGB surveillance networks were thinner and bureaucratic coordination was slower. Their destination was a village called Geritzi, population 847, located on the shore of the Rybinsk Reservoir 300 kilometers north of Moscow. Dmitry had never been to Geritzi. He had no connections there. He had selected it for precisely these reasons. It was far enough from Moscow to be outside the initial search radius, small enough that strangers would be noticed, but not immediately reported, remote enough that KGB presence would be minimal. The village had a small hotel that catered to fishermen and regional travelers. The Sokolovs checked in on November 21st under false names, paying cash for a week's accommodation. For 3 days, they lived in limbo. Dmitry and Valentina took turns watching the village's single main street, monitoring for surveillance vehicles or unfamiliar faces that might indicate KGB presence. Katya remained in their room, reading books Valentina had brought, practicing finger exercises on an imaginary piano keyboard, adjusting to enforced silence with the resilient adaptability of adolescence. They ate sparingly from canned food they had purchased in Rybinsk. They spoke in whispers. They waited. Dmitry understood that their situation was fundamentally untenable. They could not remain in Geritzi indefinitely. Their money would run out. Their absence would be noticed. Suspicion would grow. They could not return to Moscow. Whatever had triggered their flight would not have dissipated. They could not defect. Dmitry held level 1 clearance, making him a priority target for recovery, and defection would require contacting Western intelligence services, something he had no idea how to do safely. They were trapped in a space between detection and survival, with no clear path forward. Then, on November 24th, the date originally scheduled for their elimination by apartment fire, everything changed. A visitor arrived in Geritzi asking questions about strangers who might have checked into the hotel recently. The visitor was not KGB. He was not police. He was a middle-aged man with weathered hands and a face that suggested Finnish ancestry, common in northern Russia. He spoke with the hotel clerk, then departed. But his presence triggered Dmitri's paranoia. If one person was asking questions, others would follow. The dacha deception had bought time, but time had run out. Dmitri made a decision that defined everything that followed. He decided to die. Not literally, not yet, but bureaucratically. He decided that the Sokolov family needed to cease existing in official records, creating a void that would collapse the search apparatus pursuing them. The method he chose was elegant in its simplicity. He would give the KGB exactly what they wanted: confirmation that the Sokolovs were dead. On the evening of November 24th, Dmitri used the hotel's telephone to place a call to Moscow. The call went to the office of Professor Malenkov, his supervisor at the Institute of Theoretical Physics. The call lasted 3 minutes and was recorded by KGB surveillance of Malenkov's line. The transcript, declassified in 2015, is chilling. Dmitri. Yevgeny Borisovich, it's Dmitri Sokolov. Malenkov. Pause. 6 seconds. Dmitri, where are you? Do you understand what you've done? Dmitri. I understand everything. That's why I'm calling. I want you to know that I'm sorry. I never intended betrayal. I just wanted safety for my family. Malenkov. Tell me where you are. We can resolve this. You can come back. Explain yourself. It's not too late. Dmitri. It is too late. It was too late the moment I ran. I know how this works. I know what happens to people like me. So I'm calling to say goodbye, and to ask you for one favor. Malenkov. What favor? Dmitri. Tell them I was afraid. Tell them I made a terrible mistake. Tell them I'm sorry. That's all. I just wanted someone to know. Malenkov. Dmitri, where are you? Please, tell me where you are. Call disconnects. The call achieved exactly what Dmitri intended. It confirmed that he was alive, that he was somewhere with telephone access, that he was emotionally distressed. It provided the KGB with evidence of his state of mind: apologetic, fearful, suicidal. It prepared them to believe what would come next. 2 hours after the phone call, at 11:47 p.m. on November 24th, a massive fire destroyed a warehouse in the industrial district of Rybinsk, 15 kilometers from Geritzi. The warehouse stored agricultural equipment and fuel for farm machinery. The fire burned with extraordinary intensity, fueled by gasoline and diesel reserves. Local fire brigades responded, but could not contain the blaze. The warehouse collapsed at 1:30 a.m. When firefighters finally controlled the fire at dawn on November 25th, they found 3 bodies in the wreckage: an adult male, an adult female, a teenage female. The bodies were burned beyond recognition, identifiable only through dental records or DNA analysis, neither of which was standard practice in Soviet forensic investigation in 1978. The bodies were not the Sokolovs. They were homeless individuals who frequented Rybinsk's industrial district, victims of a fire that had nothing to do with state security operations. But Dmitri had understood something crucial. Burned bodies all look the same, and Soviet bureaucracy was designed to accept plausible explanations rather than pursue expensive investigations. Through means that remain unclear even in declassified documents, Dmitri arranged for the Rybinsk police to be informed that he and his family had been staying in a shelter near the warehouse, that they had been despondent, that they might have started the fire intentionally. The source of this information was described in police reports as anonymous telephone call. The caller's identity was never determined. When news of the Rybinsk fire reached Moscow on November 25th, The KGB initially dismissed any connection to the Sokolov case, but cross-referencing revealed disturbing correlations. The fire occurred hours after Dmitri's phone call, suggesting suicidal ideation, in a region where the Sokolovs might plausibly have fled, with 3 victims matching the family's general demographics. Colonel Suslov ordered immediate investigation. The investigation faced immediate obstacles. Rybinsk was 300 kilometers from Moscow, in a different oblast, under different administrative jurisdiction. Local authorities had already classified the fire as industrial accident combined with possible suicide. They had no context for why Moscow would be interested. When KGB investigators arrived and requested examination of the bodies, they were informed that local protocol called for immediate burial of unidentified burn victims to prevent health hazards. The bodies had been interred on November 26th in unmarked graves. This should have triggered further investigation, exhumation, forensic analysis, dental record comparison. But Colonel Suslov made a decision that reflected both bureaucratic pragmatism and personal desperation. He accepted the Rybinsk deaths as closure. His reasoning, preserved in memoranda that paint an unflattering portrait of Soviet institutional incentives, was brutally practical. The Sokolov case had become embarrassing. A family had fled surveillance, evaded an elimination team, disappeared completely, resurfaced only as anonymous corpses in an industrial fire. Pursuing further investigation would only emphasize the operation's failures. Better to accept the convenient conclusion that the Sokolovs had died accidentally while fleeing, file the case as closed, and move on. On December 3, 1978, the official report on the Sokolov matter concluded, subjects Dmitry Ivanovich Sokolov, Valentina Mikhailovna Sokolova, and Ekaterina Dmitrievna Sokolova died on November 24, 1978, in accidental fire in Rybinsk. Investigation finds no evidence of hostile intelligence service involvement. Case classified as security failure due to inadequate surveillance protocols. Recommend administrative sanctions for responsible personnel. File closed. Administrative sanctions were duly applied. Colonel Suslov received a formal reprimand and lost a promotion opportunity. The surveillance team that had allowed the Sokolovs to escape the dacha was reassigned to less critical duties. Professor Malenkov was questioned about his final phone conversation with Dmitri, found to have acted appropriately, and cleared of suspicion. The Institute of Theoretical Physics conducted internal review of security protocols, recommended minor procedural changes, resumed normal operations. The Sokolov family was officially dead. Their apartment was sealed, their possessions inventoried and stored, their positions at work were filled by new employees. Obituaries appeared in specialized journals, neutral language describing accomplished careers cut tragically short. 3 death certificates were issued, based on Rybinsk police reports, filed in Moscow civil records. The family ceased to exist in Soviet administrative reality, but they were not dead. They were living in Geritzi under assumed identities, having successfully staged their own deaths through a combination of desperate ingenuity and bureaucratic dysfunction. What emerged from interviews with surviving witnesses in the 1990s, from Katya Sokolova's memoir published in 2004, and from analysis of declassified documents, is that the Sokolov family lived in Geritzi for 6 years, from November 1978 until July 1984. They adopted the surname Petrov, common enough to avoid suspicion, unremarkable enough to blend into provincial anonymity. Dmitri found work as a mathematics teacher at the local school, a position that required no extensive background check and paid enough for modest survival. Valentina worked seasonally in the village library, cataloging books, leading children's reading groups. Katya finished secondary school, denied the Moscow Conservatory education her piano talents warranted, accepting limitations that survival demanded. They maintained perfect operational security for 6 years. They made no contact with former associates. They sent no letters. They celebrated no birthdays, kept no photographs, preserved no evidence of their previous existence. They became the Petrovs completely, embodying their cover identities so thoroughly that even to each other, in private, they used their false names. Valentina later described this as living inside a performance that never ended, where forgetting your lines meant death. The psychological cost was immense. Dmitri never touched physics again, spending his intellectual gifts teaching basic algebra to village children who would never use it. Valentina, trained in French literature, led reading groups analyzing socialist realist novels she despised. Katya abandoned piano entirely. The skill was too distinctive, too likely to draw attention. She worked in the village store, married a local mechanic in 1982, gave birth to a daughter in 1983. She became a provincial housewife, whose previous life as Moscow intelligentsia seemed like a dream. But survival exacted another cost that would not manifest until later. The Sokolovs had not simply fled the KGB. They had fled with secrets. Dmitri's mind still contained calculations for tactical nuclear weapons, delivery systems, target optimization. This knowledge had been classified as Level 1. Unauthorized disclosure carried sentences of life imprisonment or execution. By faking his death and disappearing, Dmitri had technically remained in possession of state secrets while no longer under state supervision. He had become, in the precise legal definition, an unsecured asset. For 6 years, this mattered to no one because everyone believed he was dead. But secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried. And in July 1984, something happened that would expose the Sokolov family and trigger the final act of their tragedy. Nikolai Kostin, whose wedding invitation had triggered this entire cascade, defected to the West. Kostin's defection occurred during a scientific conference in Prague. He walked away from his hotel, entered the British embassy, requested asylum. The defection was professionally executed. British intelligence had been cultivating Kostin since his wife's suspicious death in 1976, and his marriage to Helena Marchenko in December 1978 had provided a perfect pretext for facilitating his eventual extraction. The KGB had been watching Kostin closely, but they had fundamentally misassessed his intentions. They believed he was a security risk because of his foreign wife. They never imagined he was an active British intelligence asset. Kostin brought with him documents relating to Soviet fusion research, valuable but not devastating. But more significantly, he brought information about the Soviet security apparatus's internal paranoia, its surveillance protocols, its treatment of scientists who showed ideological wavering. During his debriefing, he mentioned the Sokolov case as an example. He described how his wedding invitation had somehow triggered suspicion of his friend Dmitri, how Dmitri had stopped returning his calls in late 1978, how Dmitri and his family had reportedly died in a tragic fire shortly thereafter. British intelligence found this narrative suspicious. The timing was too convenient, the explanation too pat. They requested CIA assistance in investigating whether Dmitri Sokolov had truly died, or whether his death had been staged by Soviet security services to cover some other outcome: arrest, forced relocation, recruitment as a double agent. The CIA agreed to investigate, seeing potential intelligence value in understanding Soviet internal security operations. CIA investigation began with standard protocols: review of Soviet newspaper archives, examination of death records accessible through Western sources, interviews with émigrés who might have known the Sokolovs. The investigation proceeded, slowly, methodically, without dramatic breakthroughs. But in October 1984, a CIA analyst noticed something anomalous in Rybinsk death records. 3 bodies from the November 1978 warehouse fire had been buried without positive identification, unusual for Soviet practice, which typically maintained meticulous records. The analyst requested further investigation. That investigation never happened, because on November 7, 1984, 67th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko appeared at the traditional parade reviewing stand on Red Square, looking visibly ill, triggering speculation about succession and internal Kremlin politics. In the bureaucratic chaos that followed, the CIA's investigation into the Sokolov case was deprioritized, then forgotten entirely. The file was closed with notation: insufficient evidence to determine subject's status, low priority, recommend no further action. But the CIA investigation had not gone unnoticed by the KGB. Routine counterintelligence monitoring had detected CIA inquiries about the Sokolov case. This triggered immediate red flags. Why would Western intelligence be interested in a family that died 6 years ago? What had prompted renewed attention? The only plausible answer was that someone with knowledge of the case had defected and raised questions. The timing pointed to Clandestine. On November 15, 1984, Colonel Viktor Maximovich Chebrikov, now KGB chairman, ordered comprehensive review of the Sokolov file. The review revealed what Colonel Suslov had deliberately overlooked in December 1978. No forensic confirmation had ever been obtained that the Rybinsk fire victims were the Sokolovs. The identification had rested entirely on circumstantial correlation and bureaucratic convenience. Given CIA interest, this suddenly seemed inadequate. Chebrikov ordered exhumation of the 3 bodies from their unmarked graves in Rybinsk. The exhumation occurred on November 24, 1984, exactly 6 years after the fire. Forensic analysis revealed what should have been obvious in 1978. None of the victims' dental structures matched records available for the Sokolovs. The bodies were not the family. The Sokolovs had faked their deaths. This revelation triggered what KGB internal documents described as catastrophic security failure investigation. If Dmitry Sokolov was alive, he had been living unsupervised with Level 1 nuclear weapons data for 6 years. He could have made contact with Western intelligence. He could have disclosed classified information. The security implications were staggering. Every weapon system Dmitry had worked on would need to be reassessed for potential compromise. Every calculation he had performed would need to be redone. The damage could be incalculable. Chebrikov issued Priority Alpha Search Authorization, the highest level of domestic manhunt authority, reserved for immediate threats to state security. Over 2,000 KGB personnel were assigned to locate the Sokolovs. Every village in Russia with population under 5,000 was to be searched systematically. Every teacher with physics or mathematics background was to be investigated. Every family with unusual history or incomplete documentation was to be scrutinized. The search began on December 1st, 1984. It reached Geritzi on December 18th. The KGB team that arrived in Geritzi consisted of 8 operatives under command of Major Ivan Konstantinovich Fedorov, a specialist in fugitive recovery. Their instructions were explicit: locate the Sokolovs, detain all family members, transport to Moscow for interrogation, determine extent of security compromise. Lethal force was authorized if subjects resisted or attempted escape. The team established themselves in Geritzi on December 18th, posing as census workers conducting routine population survey. They began systematic house-to-house interviews, collecting information about every resident, cross-referencing against documentation, looking for inconsistencies. The cover was plausible. Soviet census operations were frequent, intrusive, generally accepted as normal bureaucratic burden. But Dmitry Sokolov, even after 6 years of provincial anonymity, remained fundamentally a physicist, trained in pattern recognition, alert to anomalies. When census workers appeared in Geritzi asking questions about family backgrounds and documentation, he recognized the methodology. Census operations did not focus on verification of identity papers. Census operations did not request details about previous residents. Census operations did not photograph residents while conducting interviews. These were not census workers. These were hunters. On December 19th, Dmitry told Valentina and Katya that they needed to prepare for immediate departure. Not flight. They had nowhere left to flee, but disappearance. He had been planning for this possibility since they first arrived in Geritzi, though he had hoped never to need the plan. He had identified 3 locations within walking distance where one could shelter unseen for extended periods, an abandoned hunting lodge 4 kilometers into the forest, a storage cellar beneath the old church, a maintenance tunnel under the village heating plant. He had stockpiled supplies in each location: food, blankets, medical supplies, false documentation he had carefully forged over 6 years. If they could avoid detection for 1 week, the search team would move on. If they could remain hidden for 2 weeks, bureaucratic pressure would force the team to report failure and withdraw. But Katya complicated the calculation. She now had a 1-year-old daughter, Dmitri's granddaughter, born in Geritzi to Katya's husband, a village mechanic named Sergei, who knew nothing of his wife's true identity. Taking an infant into winter forest hiding was impossible. The child would cry, revealing their location. The child would need warmth, food, care that improvised shelters could not provide. The child would die. Katya refused to abandon her daughter. Dmitri refused to allow the child to come with them. Valentina proposed a solution that was both brilliant and terrible. Sergei was not a target. The KGB had no reason to suspect the child was connected to the Sokolovs. If Katya remained with her daughter, if she maintained her identity as Katya Petrova, wife of local mechanic, mother of infant child, the census workers would find nothing suspicious. But Dmitri and Valentina needed to disappear immediately. Katya agreed. The decision was reached with brutal pragmatism, born of 6 years living under constant threat. Dmitri and Valentina would hide. Katya would remain. If the KGB discovered Dmitri and Valentina, Katya would continue denying any knowledge of their true identity. She would claim the Petrovs had been employers, boarders, acquaintances, nothing more. Her daughter would be protected by Katya's ignorance. On the evening of December 19th, Dmitri and Valentina walked into the forest. They carried minimal supplies, enough for 3 days, after which they would need to move to a different hiding location or risk hypothermia. They settled into the abandoned hunting lodge, a structure with partial roof and broken windows. Inadequate but serviceable. Temperature was minus 18 Celsius. They built no fire, fearing smoke would reveal their position. They wrapped in blankets and waited. Meanwhile, the KGB team continued their systematic search. On December 20th, they interviewed Katya Petrova at her home. Major Fedorov's report of the interview, declassified in 2007, noted, "Subject appeared nervous but cooperative, stated that her parents, identified as Boris and Lydia Petrov, had departed village 3 days prior to visit relatives in Vologda. Subject provided address in Vologda, stated parents would return after New Year. Subject had infant daughter present during interview, appeared primarily concerned with child's welfare. No indicators of deception observed." The Vologda address Katya provided was false, invented to buy time. The KGB would verify the address, find no one matching the description, return to Geritzi with increased suspicion. But this would take days, perhaps a week. Time was what Dmitri and Valentina needed. They lasted 5 days in the hunting lodge. On December 24th, temperature dropped to minus 24 Celsius. Dmitri developed symptoms of frostbite in his left foot. Valentina's cough, initially minor, worsened to the point where breathing became difficult. They had consumed their food supplies. They had no choice but to move to the church cellar, closer to the village, warmer, but more exposed. The move saved their lives temporarily, but sealed their fate ultimately. Because Major Fedorov, frustrated by dead ends and bureaucratic pressure to produce results, had begun employing more aggressive search techniques. On December 25th, his team positioned surveillance on all routes leading from Geritzi, watching for anyone departing. They placed listening devices in public buildings, the village store, the library, the administrative office, and they pressured village officials to reveal any information about unusual residents or suspicious behavior. On December 26th, the village chief, a man named Grigory Petrovich, who had known the Petrovs for 6 years and harbored no suspicion about them, mentioned to Major Fedorov that Boris Petrov, the mathematics teacher, had seemed particularly interested in the old church when he first arrived in Geritzi, had asked questions about its history, its basement storage areas, whether anyone used them. Grigory Petrovich thought nothing of it. Boris had seemed interested in local history. But Major Fedorov recognized the significance immediately. The church cellar was searched on December 27th at 6 o'clock a.m. Dmitri and Valentina were found wrapped in blankets, hypothermic, malnourished, unable to flee. They were arrested without resistance. Major Fedorov's report recorded their condition. Both subjects suffering exposure-related illness. Male subject unable to walk due to frostbite. Female subject exhibiting respiratory distress. Both require medical attention. Transportation to Moscow inadvisable until subjects stabilized. They were held in Geritzi while medical personnel treated their immediate conditions. Katya was arrested the same day, charged with harboring fugitives and maintaining false documentation. Her daughter was placed in temporary state custody. Sergei, bewildered and betrayed, was questioned extensively, found to have genuinely known nothing of his wife's true identity, and released. On January 3, 1985, Dmitri and Valentina were transported to Moscow. Katya followed on January 5th, after her daughter had been placed in permanent state orphanage care, a punishment designed to ensure Katya's cooperation during interrogation. The three were held in Lefortovo prison, the KGB's primary detention facility, in separate cells, denied communication with each other or with legal counsel. Interrogation began immediately. The primary question was simple. Had Dmitri disclosed classified information during his 6 years of unsupervised freedom? The answer, equally simple, was no. Dmitri had touched no physics, contacted no Western intelligence services, disclosed nothing to anyone. He had been a mathematics teacher in a provincial village, living in terror, focused entirely on survival. His only crime had been fleeing rather than accepting execution. But this answer was insufficient from the KGB's perspective. They needed certainty, not assurance. They needed technical verification that nuclear weapons data had not been compromised. They needed Dmitri to prove his silence by reproducing classified calculations, by demonstrating that his memory remained accurate, by confirming that he had not fabricated simplified versions for disclosure. The interrogation continued for weeks, Dmitri sitting at tables covered with papers, writing equations while KGB analysts verified their accuracy. A mathematician once again calculating death yields for weapons he would never see used. Valentina's interrogation focused on complicity. Had she known Dmitri's work was classified? Had she understood the severity of their flight? Had she contacted anyone, family, friends, Western agencies, during their time in Geritzi? The answers were yes, yes, no. She had known everything, understood everything, told no one. She had been complicit in every decision, partner in their survival, enabler of their flight. Under Soviet law, this made her equally guilty. Katya's interrogation was brief. She had been 16 when they fled, a minor operating under parental authority. She had no access to classified information, had committed no independent crimes, but she had maintained false identity for 6 years, had married under false pretenses, had given birth to a child while using forged documentation. These were crimes, though minor compared to her parents' actions. The KGB's interest in Katya was primarily leverage. Her daughter remained in state custody, a tool for ensuring family cooperation. The interrogations concluded in February 1985. The technical assessment determined that Dmitri's memory of classified information remained accurate, suggesting he had not disclosed data to hostile intelligence services. No evidence suggested contact with Western agencies. No evidence suggested deliberate espionage. The Sokolovs had simply fled, hidden, and survived. They were not spies. They were not traitors in the conventional sense. They were security violations, assets that had removed themselves from supervision, creating unacceptable risk. The charges filed against them in March 1985 were illegal flight from state supervision, forgery of official documentation, fraud against state institutions, and, most seriously, unsecured possession of classified information. The trial was closed, conducted in a military tribunal with no press, no observers, no public record. Defense counsel was appointed by the court, forbidden from examining classified aspects of the case, effectively neutered. Dmitry received 20 years, reduced from possible execution due to his cooperation during interrogation. Valentina received 15 years, her sentence acknowledging that she had possessed no classified information herself. Katya received 5 years, suspended. She would serve no time if she maintained perfect behavior. But the conviction would remain on her record, destroying her prospects for higher education, professional employment, or restoration of custody of her daughter. The sentences were handed down on April 12, 1985. Dmitry was sent to Perm 35, a labor camp in the Urals housing political prisoners and security violators. Valentina was sent to a women's camp near Mordovia. Katya returned to Geritzi, her conviction documented, her daughter permanently lost to the state orphanage system. Dmitry Sokolov died in Perm 35 on November 7, 1987, officially from pneumonia, though fellow prisoners later reported he had been beaten by guards 3 days before his death. Valentina Sokolova survived her sentence, released in 2000 at age 64, a frail woman who had lost everything. She lived in a communal apartment in Vladimir, receiving minimal pension, never speaking about her past. She died in Tumty. Katya Sokolova, officially Ekaterina Dmitrievna Petrova, following her conviction, attempted suicide in 1992, survived, and emigrated to Germany in 1998. Her daughter, raised in state orphanages, never learned her true family history. The full truth about the Sokolov case remained classified until 2015, when Russian historians successfully petitioned for declassification of KGB files related to domestic security operations against scientific personnel, 1970-1985. The declassified documents revealed the wedding invitation's role as deliberate provocation, the surveillance operation that followed, the elimination order issued by Yuri Andropov himself. They revealed the incompetence that allowed the Sokolovs to escape the dacha, the bureaucratic expediency that led Colonel Suslov to accept false death certificates, the 6 years during which the family lived in hiding while officially dead. Most significantly, the documents revealed that Nikolai Kostin had never known about the Sokolov case's deadly implications. His wedding invitation had been genuine. He truly had wanted his old friend to celebrate his marriage. He had no idea the invitation would trigger elimination orders, had no knowledge that his friendship with Dmitry had been classified as security vulnerability. When he defected to Britain in 1984 and mentioned the Sokolov case during debriefing, he believed he was describing a tragic accident. Learning the truth that his wedding invitation had initiated a chain of events leading to destruction of an entire family devastated him. He died in London in 2001, having never forgiven himself for inadvertent complicity in his friend's fate. The Sokolov case became, in post-Soviet scholarship, an exemplar of the paranoia that characterized late Cold War security apparatus. It demonstrated how surveillance states create self-fulfilling prophecies, treating suspicion as evidence, treating fear as guilt, treating survival instincts as betrayal. The wedding invitation was simultaneously weapon and test, designed to reveal loyalties that might otherwise remain hidden, that it revealed only human fear, that it destroyed a family who had committed no actual betrayal, that it wasted scientific talent in service of security protocols that protected nothing. These ironies were not lost on historians studying the period. But perhaps the deepest tragedy was not the family's destruction, but the daughter they were forced to abandon. Katya's daughter, raised in state orphanages, given a new surname to erase connection to her convicted mother, grew up without knowledge of her grandparents, brilliance, or her family's sacrifice. She became an accountant, married, had children of her own, lived an ordinary life. She learned her family history only in 2016, when a German journalist researching declassified KGB files tracked her down and explained who her grandparents had been. Her response, recorded in the journalist's published account, was simple. "I don't know whether to feel proud or ashamed. They saved themselves through courage and intelligence. But they also left me behind. I understand why. I don't blame them. But I was the price of their survival, and I paid it my entire life." The technologies Dmitry Sokolov helped develop, tactical nuclear weapons optimized for battlefield use, were never employed in combat. Most were dismantled after the Soviet Union collapsed, their design calculations archived, their components recycled or destroyed. The specific calculations Dmitry produced during his 15 years at the Institute of Theoretical Physics exist only in classified archives, never published, never acknowledged, significant only to the specialists who might someday study the history of weapons that were designed to end the world, but never did. In Geritzi, the village where the Petrov family lived for 6 years, there is no memorial to the Sokolovs. The house they rented was torn down in 1997 to make space for new construction. The school where Dmitry taught mathematics closed in 2003 due to declining population. The library where Valentina worked part-time was converted to administrative offices. The village's population has declined from 847 in 1978 to fewer than 400 today. Young people leave for cities. Old people remember when the village was larger, livelier, more hopeful. Some residents still remember the Petrovs, though memories have faded and blurred with time. They remember Boris as a quiet man who taught well, but seemed haunted by something he never discussed. They remember Lydia as kind but distant, always reading, always slightly separate from village social life. They remember Katya as a beautiful girl who married too young and seemed too sad for her age. They remember the census workers who came in December 1984, asking questions that felt wrong somehow, and how the Petrovs disappeared shortly after, and how Katya's daughter was taken away, and how no one ever explained what happened. The church cellar where Dmitry and Valentina were captured still exists, though the church itself burned in Tunse. The cellar is now sealed, deemed unsafe, a dark space beneath ruins where 2 people once hid from the state that wanted them dead. Sometimes local teenagers force the seal and explore inside, finding nothing but darkness and old stones and the smell of earth. The wedding that triggered everything, Nikolai Kostin's marriage to Helena Marchenko on December 16, 1978, proceeded as planned, though the Sokolovs did not attend. Photographs of the event, preserved in archives opened after Kostin's death, show a happy couple, guests celebrating, no indication of the tragedy unfolding 300 kilometers away. Helena Marchenko Kostin returned to Canada with her husband after his defection, worked at the University of Toronto until retirement, died in 2019. She never knew her wedding invitation had destroyed a family. The invitation itself was lost, presumably discarded after the wedding, a small cream-colored card that altered multiple lives and then vanished into historical irrelevance. In Lefortovo prison's archives, now partially open to researchers, there exists a file labeled Sokolov, DI, closed case, 47K78. The file contains interrogation transcripts, technical assessments, sentencing documents, and one personal item: Valentina's grandmother's silver letter opener, the family heirloom she had carried from Moscow to Geritzi, the object she had placed under her pillow the night after calling Nadezhda Mandelstam. The letter opener was confiscated during arrest, cataloged as evidence, never returned. It sits in a storage box in a basement in Moscow, tarnished now, forgotten, a tool once used to open invitations that carried death inside them. The question that haunts historians studying the case is simple. What if Dmitry had not fled? What if he had accepted the apartment fire, allowing his family to die, quickly, rather than condemning them to years of fear followed by arrest and imprisonment? Would that have been mercy or cowardice? Survival or betrayal? The question has no answer, only the mathematics of choice, the calculation that one man made in a moment of fear that saved his family temporarily and destroyed them ultimately, that demonstrated both the brilliance that made him valuable to the state and the humanity that made him dangerous to it. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. Historians researched. Families learned truth they had never known. And in all the declassified documents, all the memoirs, all the scholarly studies of Cold War paranoia and security state excess, the Sokolov case appears as a footnote. 3 people who fled, hid, were captured, and disappeared into the machinery of state punishment that ground through millions of lives before finally running empty. But there is one photograph preserved in German archives, taken by Katya in 1998 after she immigrated, after she had finally escaped Russia, after she had spent years rebuilding her life. The photograph shows an old church in a small German town. Katya is standing in front of the church, holding a cream-colored envelope. Inside the envelope is a forged wedding invitation, printed on paper she purchased from a specialty shop, addressed to Dmitry Ivanovich and Valentina Mikhailovna. Sokolov, announcing a wedding that never occurred. Katya keeps the invitation in a drawer in her apartment in Berlin. She has never sent it. She has never destroyed it. It is simply there, a small cream-colored card that represents everything her family lost. Celebration, joy. The simple assumption that invitations carry only happiness, that weddings mean beginnings rather than ends, that envelopes contain futures rather than deaths waiting to unfold.